Hey, I changed computers and can you hear me? Okay, now I can see you. Can someone say something to make sure I'm listening to you?
Can you hear us?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Devin. Yeah, no, I had to change computers. I was jumping between the different breakout rooms and I realized that it was 100% me because I was hearing everyone super here and there. So again, I honestly really apologize for this very last minute inconveniences. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen again. Where is it? Okay. Cool. So hopefully this time it works. I can hear you and you can hear me. So now we're gonna get into the presentation as such. Cool. So we did our short little breakout room and icebreaker activity. I hope you got to talk to each other, know a little bit more of like the people that you're going to be engaging with in this course and who you're going to be sharing ideas and thoughts and who you have already been doing so, right, during the discussions. So just a quick overview of what the course is like or the different components of the course. Basically, the main objective of this course is how do we ignite social and ecological change through the principles of community, inquiry, and voice, right? We really want to engage with the communities and have a very critical thinking of how our communities are set up, and most importantly, give voice to the people in those communities and be listeners and take all that information in. So for this, we're going to be doing several things. We're going to be looking at the readings and thinking about the different frameworks in the field of conservation science and how communities are being involved more and more, like we've been seeing in discussion 1 and a little bit more in discussion 2 that you have been engaging with. Also, one of the key elements of this course is applying that socio-ecological framework to your particular communities or the communities that you're choosing to develop these community engagement labs. So really thinking into the social and ecological components that make up your community. And we're going to be looking at this in more detail in just a second. And also learn some of the methods to listen to the voices of your community members. So again, this is a key component of the CELs, and it's something that you are going to be actively doing during the course of the semester. And all of this together is for you to engage your community and learn together into what are the different components of your community and how can we move forward into kind of like finding solutions to some of the issues that you will be able, or that perhaps you have already looked at that are happening in your communities. Okay, so the community engagement labs are divided into 4 major components, and there are different things in between. So we're gonna have, the first component is creating a community profile. This is gonna be due in September 18th, so keep that in mind. Start thinking about the deadlines and try to plan ahead when you're doing this. Try to go to the different to-dos and what the assignment is asking for, and that way you'll be able to kind of like have a better idea beforehand and kind of like organize your time into creating the different components of these assignments. So this first step into creating a community profile, basically the main question is, what is your community, right? What are the different components, the social and ecological or environmental factors that make up your community? And also, how does the environment impact the people that are living in that community? And at the same time, how are the people impacting the environment, right? So this is part of the socio-ecological system framework, right? That you're going to be reading into more detail when you are looking at the to-do for this first CEL. And basically what you're going to be looking at is the different social components, the human components, the ecological components and the ecological processes, and how those two blend together or merge into an integrated approach, right? So when we're thinking about social processes, we can think about things of the demography of your community, right? What are the different demographic elements that make up your community? What are the livelihood activities? Is it principally an agricultural community? Is it mostly an urban area where most people work in offices? So thinking about what is it that people do to sustain their livelihoods? What are the different materials and energy that are used in your communities? What is the access to health and wellness, right? Different elements about communication and education in your community, economic issues, what is the socio-political organization? So all of these elements here that are grouped into this social process component. Then there's also human components, right? Who are the individuals? How are the households coming together? What are the different institutions that are part of your community? What are those NGOs that are most prevalent in your communities? How is the government organization? How is the city council organized and such? Then we come to the environmental factors, right? Or the ecological factors. So we have our ecological components, which are the biotic and abiotic factors that perhaps you remember from your classes before, or you've already looked into it in Project Dragonfly. But what are the individuals, populations, metapopulations, communities, the different fauna and flora that make up that environment that your community is embedded in? And what are some of the abiotic factors, right? What is the male soil components, right? Is it an arid region or is it a highly productive region? What is the water access? How are the watersheds organized, right? What are the different ecosystems and landscapes that are in your communities? And then thinking about some of the ecological processes, right? What is the primary productivity? What are the reproduction and mortality rates for some of your species of interest, right? What are the competition and mutualisms that you find? What type of pollinators you have in your community, right? Nutrient cycling, erosion, all of these ecological processes, and then bringing those together into this integration, right? So how are these ecological resources being used by the humans that are living in your community? How are they being consumed? How are they being used for production? What elements are affecting those ecological components? So for example, contamination, is it a lot of litter based mainly on plastics or chemicals and pollutants that are being washed away in the watersheds? So all of these resource use components, as well as what management strategies are in place, for example, for mitigation, adaptation, and resource use planning of all these ecological components. So here's an example, and here I'm gonna let Devin explain a little bit of how was the process for her to develop this socio-ecological system of Reynoldsburg, which I, not until reading her CEL, I learned that brings Ohio very close to tomatoes, and I'm very new in Ohio. So I'm gonna give the microphone to Devin and let her kind of explain to you how she put together this socio-ecological system of Reynoldsburg. Go ahead, Devin.
Thanks, Laura. So when I was really looking into my community, and this is a really great way to get to know your community, especially for people that might not feel as integrated within it. Despite being there for 5 years, I really didn't know a whole lot about my community. As far as Columbus, that has a lot of social ecological issues, but I really wanted to narrow it down and kind of see what my smaller community was all about. So I know that my community was kind of it's an urban center, but it's right on the edge of country. So urbanization is a big issue there as far as encroaching into agricultural fields and building in new buildings and things like that. So I did a little bit of research and just kind of found some of the issues that affect this smaller town. Urbanization and the social processes, that's kind of the big thing. So moving out into the agricultural fields, population increases. I think we had like a 19% increase in population. So that was also building of new neighborhoods and adding more concrete areas to this, which kind of was more important for when I found my ecological issue that I covered for the CEL, which was urban flooding. And a lot of industry changes and shifts that were part of this. So moving away from agricultural jobs and into more industrialized ones. The human components, we have like the different, I guess, groups that are involved in this. So the Department of Agriculture is about 5 minutes down the road from my house. So that was kind of interesting. They deal with a lot of the invasive species and a lot of the different, like, I guess, a lot of different things in that component, but there's also the city council. Alexander Livingston is a person that influenced the whole city of Reynoldsburg, like Laura was talking about. We're the home of the tomato, which is super fun. We even have a tomato festival in August, which is interesting. Haven't been to it yet, but so a lot of these different human components, social processes that I found. And then I went and I looked at some of the ecological issues. So invasive species is a big one that's probably pretty prevalent in a lot of your communities. Honeysuckle being a big one in Ohio. Green space issues, that's going to be for a lot of those that live in bigger cities. Not so much Reynoldsburg, a little bit because of the agricultural reduction, but the bigger cities, so green spaces being an issue for a lot of the social issues as well. Endangered and threatened species. We have a couple species within Ohio that are threatened. One of them being the long-eared bat, I believe. There's also a fish that is now functionally extinct. There's a couple, I think the giant salamanders, I can't remember the name exactly at the moment. Let's see. And then the ecological processes, kind of along the same lines, flooding, the glaciation that's really important to Ohio that shaped a lot of these fertile soils and things like that. Bird migration, it being a flyway, Ohio's a big flyway, really into birds. So this is something that I was trying to look into as well. Let's see, climate change being a big factor as well, kind of tying in with the flooding. And then going into the integration. So then taking both of those components and just kind of seeing how they kind of work together was like looking into the flood mitigation. We have a gypsy moth program that kind of eradicates some of the invasive species. And then city council does a lot of the laws and regulations around a lot of these things that we looked into as well. But this is just the SES framework, and this kind of helps you guys explore your own communities and find a lot of the issues that are important to the communities that you live in.
Yeah, thank you, Devin. So yeah, this is like a really great example of that socio-ecological framework and how it's put together also in a very graphically appealing way. I'm going to show you the example of a different student from last year who also made this kind of like diagram. So that's just so you know, like different ways of doing this, right? So this is from the Jennifer Lavelle, who is our student leader in section B, right? And this is part of her socio-ecological framework, right? So she has the social processes. What is the population of the place? So this was in Ticonderoga, New York. And I don't know if I'm butchering the name of Ticonderoga. I've never heard it before. So I hope I'm saying it correctly or close enough. But we can see that Jennifer here, like she looked at the population. So the different demographic elements, right? What is the poverty level? What is the racial composition that we see in this place? What is the median income, right? And all of those are things that ultimately can affect the management strategies of natural resources. What are the main industries in the place? Very different perhaps to Devon's community, which was very like focused on agriculture. Here, when I read Jennifer's CEL, you can see that there's a lot of history about a paper mill in the area. So that is another element that is really important for this first exercise, is thinking about the history of the area, not just over the last couple of decades, but like more of a long-term history, right? Not just geological history of how were the different ecological components of your community put together, but also like the whole process of colonization in the US, right? How can that affect the community that we see today, right? And then also think about development, and then in the human components, we can think about like the infrastructure. So we have the different local government institutions and healthcare institutions, the parks and recreation elements, the library, you have your public schools, the community college. So all of these institutions that make up the human components that different people in your community are using. And similar to Devon, here in the ecological components, you can see the different biotic and abiotic elements, right? So you have, again, the presence of invasive species, the different soil compositions, right? So mountains that are rich in mineral resources, the pristine lake and river system, the richness of the soil, and then your ecological processes, right? So what is influencing that? The weather, the topography, the land coverage, etc. And then how do all those come together? So resource use, how are humans using the resources of the natural elements? So sustainable agriculture, sustainable tourism. This is a place that is very visited by tourists. So how do those two come together and integrate in how the community is using those natural resources and how it's being managed by different institutions such as the government, private organizations, education and outreach programs, rewilding programs, etc. Okay, so that is CEL number 1, and I could not stop myself into putting a woolly monkey photo in here because I love woolly monkeys, as you've already read. So given that this is the first component of the CEL that you will be presenting, I want to know if anyone has any questions, and I'm checking in the chat here. So again, please raise your hand. I'm going to start reading the different elements that are, or the different messages in the chat. So Hallie asks, is this the type of graphic we're going to create? So yes, something like what David presented, or something like what I showed you that Jennifer did last year as well. Those two are 100% correct. You can use those graphical elements. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if Hallie or someone else here, it's like a very art oriented. I am not that art oriented. I wish I was. So what Devin presented was absolutely beautiful, like with the different little icons of the humans and the plants and how you integrate them. That was beautiful. But it doesn't need to be as elaborate as that in terms of the graphical elements. What I'm really looking into is how you are populating that Venn diagram and the different components of your communities. Audrey asks, how narrow or broad should we be for defining our community? For example, I live in a small town. Could I also include surrounding areas? That is one of the elements that you can put into, like, if you see that those surrounding areas are influencing your community and how people are relating with nature, absolutely included, right? I also live in Oxford, Ohio, and the community itself, I would not say that Oxford is a super agricultural area, but you drive 5 minutes away or even 2 minutes away from the urban area, and all you have is agricultural fields, which is 100% influencing these dynamics, human ecological dynamics that we are experiencing both within the city of Oxford and its surroundings. So definitely, if you feel that the surrounding of your community is influencing your community, go ahead and include it. Hallie asked again, I'm curious as well about defining community. Could I define an industry or occupation-based community, such as farmers in King County? Absolutely. Yeah, like those are the different elements that you want to include and think about how is this farmer community affecting the socio-ecological component. And this is going to become really useful, and maybe Devin can talk to us a little bit more about it in terms of when you're thinking who you're going to be interviewing. This is when you really want to think, okay, which are these community members that are having a high impact in these socio-ecological processes. What's your take on that, Devin?
Yeah, I do have to just say one thing. Be careful expanding your community too much, because that can also become really overwhelming. So
Yeah,
like I was originally interested in the whole city of Columbus, and you would be surprised at how many social ecological issues that you can find. And it gets very complicated the way that all of them work together, which I mean, it's super interesting and everything, but I'd say that it was pretty time consuming trying to find all of those issues and how they work together. And it's also a good time if you want to narrow it down a little bit to really get to know like your very like smaller community. I found it really interesting to learn a lot about Reynoldsburg. And your community can be defined as really, I mean, city, county, it can be defined as a neighborhood even. One of my group members, she did her like HOA region because she lived in this little lakeside community, which was really interesting. So it's really about how you define what your community is.
and that answers a little bit Ezekiel's question, right? That it's the opposite of Audrey's. Living in a major metropolitan area, you cannot focus on the entire metropolitan area. That would be, you would be, and think back, and here's where I like how this course is set up. Think about the very, very first exercise that we did in the welcoming activity, right? Think about that spatial scale, right? Once you go into that drone view, once you are looking at the entire metropolitan area, sure, you can have a big picture idea, but you're going to lose a lot of the details that are really affecting or how your community is really organized. If you have like, if you're trying to include the entire city of Columbus or your entire metropolitan area, right? That's when, like Devin is saying, you really need to narrow it down to a point where you can have that level of resolution, just like what you did. In a lot of people were in their backyards when they did this exercise, right? You would not be able to see the interaction of the ants and the plants that are in your backyard if you're having that drone aerial view of your backyard, right? Also, if you're just focusing on the ant and the plant species, you're missing a lot of what's happening around, right? So think what makes more sense for your community or for what you want to target and the different issues that might interest you, right? To what level, to what scale are you going to be defining your community? So Ali asks, so my community could be my organization. I think it really depends on what your organization is. I don't know exactly what it is, but think about like, is your organization having such a significant effect on the ecological components that you can find those relationships itself? Or should you think a little bit, and again, this is kind of like thinking in that ant plant example, right? If you just stay in your organization, are you being able to see the different elements that could be affecting? So really put into thought this exercise about the spatial scale that we did in the very, very first assignment into what is that degree of resolution that you want to look into to really understand your community. A lot of people were talking about cities, but their cities are small. Some people just focus on their neighborhood, right? Some people focus on their garden and a couple neighbors. And so really think about how that scale into what you're including in this first CEL. So Ali's writing the aquarium, right? So I would think, and I'm gonna let Devin also maybe give her take on this. The aquarium might be just too small. You're thinking about like an enclosed community, so to speak, where you're not really understanding what's happening around. You don't know how your aquarium might be affecting your neighborhood if you never get to interview your neighborhood. You don't know how the aquarium on itself, think about the history, what we were talking. When developers were thinking about including this aquarium in that place, they had to take into account the neighborhood where they were putting the aquarium, right? And based on that is the different people that are around. So really thinking about like the aquarium on itself, is it affecting the socio-ecological components that you see happening? I don't know, Devin, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same boat there. I think the aquarium is a good focus point, but just think about how that aquarium connects with your community. So maybe like the city and what kind of laws and regulations that this aquarium has to go through, and like how it affects the surrounding neighborhood from an ecological standpoint or an economic one. And you'll kind of see a little bit of that too once you look at some of the bonding, bridging, and linking, I think, interactions too that'll be important with the CEL. That's a good component.
And to answer your other question, Ali, about will this first CEL be what's built off for future CELs? It is a scaffolded project where you are basically what you do on your first CEL, you're going to continue, but doesn't mean that what you do on your first CEL is going to mandate what you do in your other CELs. There's of course a lot of flexibility. And as you're going through the process, you're gonna realize that things that maybe at the beginning you were like, oh my gosh, this is super important. Maybe later on you're like, oh, maybe not that much, and vice versa. Things that you were like, oh, this is like a marginal issue. Then you're like, oh wow, this is like a major element of what's affecting my community. And I see Devin kind of like smiling and laughing. Did you have that experience?
Yeah, I really, so I was looking at since I'm very interested in birding, I was actually more focused on the migratory pathway, and I do a lot of volunteer work now for Lights Out Columbus that looks at the migratory pathways. But with Reynoldsburg being as small as it is, with not very many tall buildings, it wasn't really a big component within my city. So I had to find another type. So I focused more on the flooding issues and found a lot of really cool things and a lot of cool connections, I guess, that came from it in the end.
So think of it as a work in progress, right? You're doing your first CEL, you're including what you think it's important or not, but as you're going through, doesn't mean that first diagram that you present, you can keep modifying it. And that is like a really valuable point, not just of this course, but in general, right? Like things are work in progress that as you start learning more about your community, you're going to find more nuances and more of the little details that make part of this socio-ecological framework. Cool. Any other questions? How does this fit in with group work? You mean like your CEL groups?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe that's something that I should have clarified at the beginning, because I feel like there tends to be a little bit of confusion. These projects are individual projects. Each of you is living in a different community. Even if there's two people that are living in San Diego, you might not be living in the same neighborhood or have the same community, right? So these projects are all individual. What are the CEL groups? The CEL groups are designed for you to give each other feedback on your own personal projects. So basically, you're going to come together and it's kind of like a sharing of ideas. And then, for example, Devin tells me like, oh, I think this is super important. And I can be like, just how we've been doing in the discussions, like, oh, have you thought about this thing? I heard on the news the other day that blah, blah, blah. And that can be a very valuable resource for Devin to include in her project. So keep in mind that even though you're gonna have these CEL working groups, they are working groups to give each other feedback, but they are not group. This is not a group project. Does that answer your question, Nikki?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Any other questions? If you come up with something later, we have more space for questions at the end. Okay. Oh. Okey doke. Okay, so the second element of the CEL, once you have kind of defined or have an idea of what your community is, you're gonna do an exercise about building social capital. This is due on October 2nd. And basically what you're doing here is that you wanna ask the questions, what is the social capital of your community and your life? So you're gonna be looking at three main elements: bonding, bridging, and linking. In bonding, basically what you're going to do is you're going to find those similar goals and missions that people within your community have, right? So what are those intersections that different people might be like, ooh, Devin and I are interested in birding, right? We are both interested in protecting the environment. We're both interested in migratory routes, right? So those are those similar goals and missions that we might have. Let's protect migratory species. Then you're going to be looking at bridging, right? So how are you connecting the different ideas and missions, right? So what are the elements that we are connecting in and making those bridges between our similar interests? And then in linking, you're thinking of more of a larger picture, the larger structures that link organizations and missions. So for example, in bridging, you can think of a particular NGO that is focused on migratory birds, right? That is bringing different people together that have similar goals and missions. And then in larger structures that link those organizations and missions, you're thinking more of a bigger picture. And then for this, basically what you wanna be asking is who is working in your community? How are they working together or not, right? How are we working in the same organizations or working towards the same goals? And how are you connected to your community, right? I don't know if Devin wants to, I read a little bit of your CEL and I don't know if you want to share your experience of like, I thought I was connected to my community, but then I realized that I was not as connected as I thought I was. I thought that was a really kind of like valuable moment of your CEL for you and your engagement with the community.
Yeah, I realized pretty quickly that I didn't feel connected to my community at all. I felt like I was kind of just in this little bubble and I wasn't really branching out and getting to know any of the issues or the organizations or anything really about my community. So this was the perfect experience to just do a little exploration, and I met a lot of really cool organizations and stuff that had similar goals and things in mind. With the urban flooding, I mean, it was interesting. I kind of actually found out about the urban flooding because there's a local bar in my town that was highly affected by this. We had a pretty good flash flood and we live right along this creek bed, and they ended up having to close down for like a week because of the flooding. And so that was right along the time that I was doing this CEL. So I found that as a perfect excuse to kind of look into that a little bit more.
Cool. So yeah, again, like this is really that chance to really engage with your community and kind of get out of your comfort zone and out of the little bubbles that we tend to live in. And then after this, we're going to do a community mapping exercise. So this has changed a little bit from last year's in that here it's going to be an exercise where you're just going to kind of like practice creating maps. One of the major components here is doing mapping exercise, a participatory mapping exercise where basically with your community, you're bringing ideas together and you're either by hand or in a computer or in an application, you're kind of like having this spatial element of how are things connected and what are the different elements and how are people relating spatially within your community. This year, we took a different approach and we decided to do this community mapping exercise a little bit earlier on to get you practicing on creating maps. And then you're going to build this community mapping exercise using these participatory methods, right? And when you're doing these maps, think about like, what are the different landmarks that are in your community, right? What are the different, for example, the parks? I think here Devin had like the different parks that are here. What are some of the relevant buildings? So for example, I don't know if this is the case of these 2 points, but like if it's city, like the courthouse or like where city council meets, etc. And also larger areas of interest that perhaps you cannot just pinpoint with a little pin, but for example, flooding areas. What are the areas that are more susceptible for flooding? This is eventually what you want to end up completing, right? So this is like the finalized community mapping that Devin did with her community after including other people's feedback. But what we're going to do for this first exercise is just you thinking of what are some of those elements that you might consider that are important before having these meetings with people. And it's just to get you practicing on how to create these maps. Again, remember that this is like a different scaffolded assignments to put together this project. And then comes the big major component of the CEL, that is formulating community questions and your community research week. These are due in October 15 and October 30th. And basically here, what you're gonna be doing is listening to your community, right? So the very first step for listening to your community, you need to have some idea of what you're gonna be asking them, right? You're not gonna just go and be like, hey, tell me about your parks, and that's it. You wanna have a little bit more tailored questions. So basically, the very first thing that you wanna think about is what is one socio-ecological issue in your community that you are interested in? For example, Devin chose like flooding, right? This is a socio-ecological issue where both humans and the ecological components come together and end up in this issue that is flooding and how it affects both humans and animals and plants and the ecosystem altogether, right? You want to ask both spatial and non-spatial questions, right? You can be particular about like, oh, what is your connection, or how did you get to this particular park, or how did you find about this park? I remember from the first exercise, I don't remember who it was, but there was a student that was talking about their park in their neighborhood, and I was like, yeah, but it's not often visited by people in the area. So is it a spatial situation? Is it a socioeconomic situation? Asking these questions is going to be really important. And then you're also going to start thinking who you're going to be interviewing, right? Whose voices are important in your community for this particular issue of interest. So who's impacted by the problem? I'm going to keep using Devin's example, right? But who is the most impacted by the flooding in that community? Who is part of the problem? Who is contributing to flooding increasing or not in the area? Or who is part of the solution? What are the different organizations that are advocating for different, mitigation strategies to avoid flooding? So thinking about who you're going to talk to, who you're going to be interviewing is really important to think beforehand, because that is really going to define how you put together your project and the type of results that you get from this exercise. And then the other important element is how do you ask questions to learn more about different perspectives on the issues? try not to ask questions that perhaps you can find somewhere else, either from the literature or perhaps looking in other sources, but really questions that are about the perspectives of your community members that you won't be able to find anywhere else, right? So, sorry, I got ahead. And basically, that is what I was saying. Like, really think about how you're going to get the different perspectives, how to avoid perhaps some bias on, I'm just going to talk to these people, and maybe you are excluding a whole set of people that might have a different vision or a very different perspective about that issue that you're talking about, right? When thinking about, like, for example, I don't know, like chemical runoff from agricultural fields, thinking both about the farmers and people that are being affected because their watersheds are contaminated, right? So getting those different perspectives becomes really important to have a really holistic approach to your issue. And then after you've thought about these questions for your community, you're going to go into this community research week where you're going to be doing these semi-structured interviews, right? So kind of like some guided questions. And that's when you're going to do these maps, these community mapping exercises that are participatory, in the sense that you're not just going to include your own perspectives, but you're going to be working with other people and having their input in creating these maps. And if you don't know like the specifics of these right now, I don't want you to get too overwhelmed. All of these steps are very detailed in the to-dos and in the readings, but I'm just giving you like an overview of what the different components of the CEL are. And then the last element is just summarizing the voice of your community. That's towards the end of the semester on November 6th. And basically, here what you want to do is make a map that includes your information, share what you learned about your community, and really, this is like the big key, the last element, really reflect on your answers. The point of this is not like, oh, I did this and I did that, and then I went to this house, and then I went to this other house, but really thinking of, okay, when I interviewed this person, I learned that this issue is affecting them in a way that I never thought before, or this issue is being connected to them, but to this other part of the community in some other ways. So really reflecting on your answers and not just summarizing the different steps of the CEL is going to become really important in this last section. And here, basically, wait a second. And then towards that last part, when you're summarizing, here you're going to depict the different regions. This is when you're going to learn and reflect on the different elements. And here I'm going to let Devin talk a little bit, because I found two kind of like sentences that she included in her CEL that are very telling to this last part, and kind of like how we want you to reflect upon the different components of the CEL and your engagement with the community.
Yeah, so this is the map that I made for the end of mine. Just kind of covered the city of Reynoldsburg and just the different components in it. But I interviewed a few different types of people. So some that were experts, and then some that were just community members living within Reynoldsburg. And I got a lot of different things out of each of the people by listening to what they had to say. So the expert really he was really cool, because he actually sent me a map of all the flooding that has occurred, and some of the areas that are more susceptible to flooding in the community. So he kind of pointed out like a lot of the floodplains and neighborhoods that are more susceptible. So I learned a lot about like the very technical parts of that from him. But then from the community members, they talked about like how their neighborhoods were structured. So some of these neighborhoods that were in the floodplains that may not have been built correctly, and they didn't know about this kind of issue when they moved into these houses. And now that this is a big factor in like flood insurance and things like that within their community. I didn't really know about any of that until she kind of told me about that. And then there's a different community in this neighborhood that isn't as affected, at least the homes aren't damaged, but that's because the homes were built more structurally sound to kind of not be as affected by flooding as the other neighborhood. So you learn a lot of different things talking to different people. So that's kind of the important part here, is to get a good mix of people that you speak with, both experts and community members.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions on the CELs and the different components? And again, if all of this is sounding too overwhelming and you're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea how I'm gonna do this, do not worry. This is all very detailed, well explained, and both Devin and I are here to like answer any questions that you might have as you're going along. Devin told me this morning as well that she's very happy and to share her CEL with you all. That way, you can also like have an idea of what is expected, right? And what are the different elements that should go into the project. I know for some people, it's sometimes a lot easier to be like, oh, okay, this is what they're asking for. And that might maybe alleviate some anxieties about this project that you may or may not have. And again, we're happy to answer any questions as you're moving forward with the project. We do want to give you and this for those that are in section A of the bio 631. You can find this in the Shoot the Breeze. Devin very gracefully wrote a set of tips that might help you when you're putting together this project, but I found them extremely important and valuable. So I decided to include it here for both sections. So first of all, and this is basically for everything, if you can, and I know not all of us have the time to plan ahead, but as much as you can plan ahead these different CELs. It's really important because there are, and you've already been experienced, there are a fair amount of readings that come with the CL and in the course in general. And I know many of you are taking other courses, and sometimes deadlines are happening on the same day or similar days. So plan ahead of the different components, how you're gonna be building together, putting together this project. Think about the different CELs. We're not asking you, oh, give me a final project at the end. We're asking you to do the different components and at the end present the final project. Try to do that for each of the CELs that we're asking you to present. So for CL 1, 2, 3, and 4, think about the different elements. And as you go to the to-do, there are going to be different guiding questions that is going to help you kind of put together the different CELs. So today, I'm going to learn about the history of my community. Tomorrow, I'm going to look into the demographics of my community, and that will really help you put together the different components. So as Devin mentions, plan ahead and just do a little bit at a time, and it will become less overwhelming at the end. And I'm going to let Devin say this because she wrote this. So it is your voice.
Yeah, this is actually kind of one of my favorite parts about this class. And I was talking to Hallie and Sophia about this a little bit earlier, but the peer feedback, so those groups that you're put into for your CELs are really, really helpful. I became really close with my members, and you just get a ton of ideas from them. Like, this is going to be one of the major like peer feedback components of this course. You get a lot of ideas, you get a lot of like recommendations on how to maybe fix the questions that you're asking your community members, or come up with different ideas of ecological problems that you could research. The peer feedback is really great, but also try not to do the thing where you say, that's great, everything's fine, because it's not really constructive, and you want to be able to learn from one another. And so the more that you put into this, the more you're going to get back. So
And think about the discussion that we already went through, right? Discussion 1, where a lot of people were getting really amazing feedback, right, from their peers. And it was like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about that. And then I started seeing like these really cool, engaging conversations. And then another person would jump in. I'm like, I was reading one for discussion 2, and it's like, please don't consider this as my supportive post, but I just want to say that this is really cool. And then you start learning about other people and then giving feedback on things that you've never thought about before, right? So that is really cool. And what Devin mentions is really important, which happened a little bit in the first discussion to some extent, that I feel like we've all come to this point where we want to be like really nice and polite to each other and just give like positive feedback, which is great and it's super important. And we all need, I personally need those ego boosts that keep me going. I'm like, okay, pat in the back, I'm doing things right. But how is that advancing my train of thought? How is that advancing into me developing a question more thorough, or think about it in ways that I hadn't thought before? So when you're giving peer feedback, like Devin said, giving that positive reinforcement is great. But also the most rewarding feedback is usually when you feel challenged into asking those questions. And that's what's really going to take your project to the next level. So yeah, that's a really good point. This one's super important.
this one's especially important for the CELs. So expect the unexpected. That can be taken a couple different ways, but so one of them, having backups. I think in one of your CELs it says you're going to interview 3 community members. My suggestion is to have more than that, just to have as backups. So yes, you'll interview 3 people, that's great, but also have a couple backups just in case, because not everybody's going to be available or willing to talk with you as you might have expected. And then as far as the really cool part about this is, I wasn't expecting to make the types of connections that I did within this course. So I kind of found these really neat things that I could do along with urban flooding that I wasn't really planning for. For example, this semester, I'm actually taking another course for Master Rain Gardener. So that's one way to help with flood mitigation. And I didn't think that I was going to make that kind of connection here. So it's kind of fun.
So yeah, and again, like someone asked before, like whatever you write on your CEL1, even if that's not what your final project is focusing on, that is part of the process and that's going to be helping you a lot. So being flexible and understanding that things often don't go as we plan them. And I'm sure everyone has experienced this at some point in their lives. You're like, okay, I'm going to do this, Monday this, and then you're like, oh, this didn't really work out, or this person didn't, or this person got sick and now I cannot interview them. So think about flexibility and adaptation as well. I just saw that Hallie wrote, when you're interviewing community members in participatory mapping, is it the same community members throughout the process? I will say, and again, I'm gonna let Devin talk from her experience, but what I've done in the past is like, once you're interviewing your community members, take advantage of that, right? Take advantage that you're with them, you're sitting with them, pull out a sheet of paper. Like, you don't have to have a map set up already into being like, okay, on this map, you can just have a blank paper and tell them like, okay, can you show me like, what are the different bodies of water that you're using for your agricultural, I don't know, whatever question it is, but asking them, just take a paper and a pencil and draw your farm. Where is the entrance of your farm, right? Where is the house of that farm? What are the different crops? And where are the different lakes? And that will give you a spatial view of how things are working in an urban area. show me, draw which are the different parks you visit. Do you know of other parks that you're aware of, but you don't visit? How far away are they from your house? Draw me your house. So again, if you have the person already there that you're interviewing, I will say take advantage of that and go ahead and ask them to do this participatory mapping exercise. That doesn't mean that every person you interview is going to be doing the mapping exercise, and that everyone that is doing the mapping exercise you need to interview. So how was your experience, Devin, while you were doing these exercises?
Yeah, I definitely took advantage of the small amount of time that I was working with. So I did it twofold. I kind of posed my questions to go along with the mapping exercise, like looking forward to it, just to kind of get an overview of my community. But I asked them, right during the interview, like, where are some of the areas that you've seen flooding, and what are some of the communities that are affected, and what are ways that you can help in the end, and things like that. So I definitely kind of did what Laura was talking about there.
So I will say always carry blank sheets of paper and a pencil, because I feel like in my experience that has been the most, where I've learned the most. Sometimes when you come in with a map that it's already set up, you're immediately like kind of like putting boundaries in how you want them to think spatially. If you just put a piece of paper and you ask them like, draw me your house and your surroundings and that, you will learn so much more. I'm not saying you have to do it that way. Maybe use a combination of the two, of like, okay, draw this and then look at this map. How do you relate to the different elements of this map? That can also be really, really useful. But yeah, always carry blank sheets of paper and pencils or pens. That will be very, very useful. And then this one, of course.
Yep. This one's just kind of keep in mind that, like, you guys are in this program for a reason, right? To find things that you're interested in, really delve into this. This is a great opportunity to do this. Have fun with it. Pick something that's super interesting to you and that you're going to connect with, because the more you connect with it, the more you're going to get out of it. So you just don't even know the connections that you'll make from the end of this.
And how this is gonna be part of your master plan, or how this is gonna be key in future courses, like Devin was mentioning. That sometimes right now you might be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna do the CEL, but I'm gonna do something else. This might be super useful or a key element for your future projects that you might not be aware of right now. Okay, some real quick, I just want to mention a couple things of some additional resources. I know not everyone has a lot of experience with writing. I myself, when I started my dissertation, I had to look a lot for help. Also, English is my second language. So I used as many resources as I could. And Miami University has a great center. It's called the Howie Writing Center, and they do online consultations. So if you look down here is the like the URL, the website address. But if you just type on Google Howie Writing Center, you can make an appointment and talk to them, and they will help you through the writing process if you find yourself struggling with writing this. And of course, you can also reach out to me, and I'd be happy to, like, if you have a draft that you're like, oh, I don't know, I have this draft and I'm not feeling ready to submit it, send it my way. I'll give a quick read to it and I'll give you some quick feedback before you can submit it. I'm super happy to do that. And then I realized for the other course that I'm teaching that a lot of people are not aware that as Miami University students, you have Zoom and you don't have to limit your meetings to 40 minutes. So I was meeting with a student group discussion leaders the other day, and they're like, ooh, we have 5 minutes to finish off our ideas. I'm like, you can have a limited Zoom. So when you're meeting with your CEL groups, use this resource and go through Miami University Zoom. Here's the website address, miamioh.zoom.us, and it'll prompt you to it. You can enter with your Miami OH email and your password, and you don't have to limit your meetings to just 40 minutes. And you can use it when you're meeting with non-Miami people. So if you want to talk to your parents or your nieces or whatever it is on the other side of the country or the world, I talked to my parents in Colombia. You can also use this resource. So keep that in mind, that you don't have to limit your meetings to only 40 minutes. And these are just some resources. Miami has a bunch of amazing resources. It's just a matter of finding them. Okay, any questions about this? We are running short on time, so I'm gonna skip these questions section real quick, and I'm just gonna talk really fast about the discussions. This is gonna be very short because we've already done the discussions, and all of you are doing an amazing job in engaging really well with the discussions. So just to remind you that science is a discussion and a process, not a body of facts. We're not just reading these things to spit out facts and being like, oh, okay, I did the reading and I know what they say and this is what it is. It's all a process, right? And the readings that we are assigning, and in general, the readings are not necessarily the facts, but they're conversation starters. And this is exactly what we want you to do in the discussions, is maybe synthesize, like the readings that you're responding with the prompt, but really give some thought into it. Do you agree with the ideas that are presented? I know a lot of people, I myself was, I don't want to say angry because angry is not the word, but shocked and a little bit surprised with the bottleneck to breakthrough paper from the first discussion. A lot of people were like, yeah, what about reproductive rights? And then I'm like, for example, one thing that I love doing for the papers that I read, especially the ones that get an emotional response from me, go through, look, who are the authors? Look them up, search them, see what racial background they have. Are they male? Are they female? What seniority level they're at, right? So all of these are, because even though science is supposed to be objective, it's not. I consider myself a really good scientist, but I have my own background, I have my own biases, and all of that is going to be reflected in the articles. So really keep in mind and have that critical thinking of like, oh, these facts are really well described, or these are, I don't know, they seem odd. Go dig in a little bit deeper. Who is writing it? What is their background? Are they including voices? Think about like the RCLs. What voices are being reflected in the authorship of those papers? Are they including, when talking about, I don't know, ancestral lands or indigenous territories, do they have an indigenous person that is part of the co-authors? When talking about reproductive rights, do they have women that are part of the co-authors? When they're talking about colonialism, do they have people from the global south that are part of the authors and are bringing in their perspectives? Or are we just hearing the voice of a few people from a specific demographic? So that is really something that I like doing myself, and I invite you to do with the readings that we are assigning. And think about how that is influencing how you are taking like the main takeaways of these readings and engage in that conversation, right? Also bring in, and everyone is doing this amazingly well, bring ideas and concepts from other resources to your main post. Oh, while I was reading this, I really thought about this other thing that I read last year or that I'm reading right now, and bring it into the conversation. And this is something that I mentioned in the email that I sent you all, that is cite your sources. A lot of people wrote, or a few people wrote like, oh, in the article, it was interesting that blah, blah, blah. And it's like, what article? I don't know which article you're talking about, or they put it in the citation, in the in-text citation, but then I don't know where to find that resource, right? So putting your references at the end is also going to be super important. And for the supportive posts, we already talked a little bit about this, but it's like, make it a discussion, not just that positive reinforcement of like, oh, your discussion post was great, but how do you take that information from someone else's substantive post and add to it? How do you take it to the next level? Ask a question that takes the discussion further. Share resources that provide more information. Oh, your post reminds me of this thing, and share that resource and add a different perspective or ideas, right? Like, oh, when I looked into the authorship of this paper, I thought that it was a little bit biased. Why do I think it's biased? How can we improve that? Maybe including more voices, etc. And something that, again, you're already doing, and I really enjoy seeing you do, is like what I was mentioning, not just having A/B conversations of like, I just reply to Devin and Devin just replies to me, but if you see a different discussion or conversation, and even if you don't want to add a supportive post to it and being like, oh my gosh, this is really cool, I've never thought of it, and I just wanted to pop in and say that I really appreciate your post, that is really, it keeps that conversation going into not just being like one-on-one, but really think about it as a roundtable, or if we were a group of people that were discussing a topic together. And that's it. Respond to other comments and questions, people that are taking the time to give you feedback, even if it's just a short acknowledgement of, oh, thank you so much, I've never thought about it. It helps to, especially on this type of courses that are all online and we're not having that human interaction face to face, just hearing that short acknowledgement of like, oh, okay, someone read my post and someone took the time to read the feedback that they gave, it's really valuable. And it makes this Project Dragonfly community what it is, where we really support each other. And it's not just like, I'm just writing things that I don't know if anyone is gonna read. So yeah. And you can do this. Little Woolly Monkey's telling you, I'm telling you, Devin is telling you, you can do this. I know it can seem overwhelming. We're both here, and by both I mean Devin and I, not the monkey. The monkey's in the Amazon. It's not gonna give you any feedback. But we're both here to really support you and help you with any questions that you might have. And I'm sorry that this took way longer than I expected. I tend to talk more than I'm used to, especially when I'm nervous. And this is my first time meeting you, so I was nervous. So I'm really glad to get to see some of your faces. And yeah, if you have any questions, please go ahead and let us know. And again, if any question comes up, you can always email me, email Devin, or my office hours are posted, but I'm super flexible. If you cannot make it to the office hours, you can just be like, can we meet at a different time? And I'm super happy to do so. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Where's my Zoom?
Just want to say thank you for breaking it down like that. Kind of excited to do the work. So
yeah, I'm excited to read it. Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you so much for being here. I know it's a Saturday afternoon and we all have activities that we would like to be doing. So I really appreciate you taking the time of being here. And again, please shoot me an email, go to my office hours. And if you have any questions, or if you just wanna some other positive reinforcement of like, I don't know if I'm doing things right, I'm super happy to read through drafts and give you feedback so you feel more comfortable with anything. Cool. Oh, thank you. See, like, we need those ego boosts. That helps me.
Thanks. This has been great and also gets me really excited about the project. So thanks, y'all.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna end the recording and I'll be posting it shortly. And thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
thank you.
Bye, everyone.